Bergen. It gives me a lot of pleasure to introduce my friend, Dr. Marc Sageman, friend and colleague, the author of an excellent book, Understanding Terror Networks, and the author of also an excellent book, the new book, Leaderless Jihad. Marc is probably one of the very few people in the world who's both a qualified flight surgeon and a former CIA case officer. He's both a medical doctor and a PhD. He's a former, present and former forensic psychiatrist. Marc will speak for approximately 30 minutes, and then we'll take questions and answers. Please identify yourself when you ask a question, and in fact, Dr. Sageman will probably repeat your question just so the C-SPAN audience can hear it. So with that, Marc.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to have been invited here. I wish to thank Peter and Steve Cole, unfortunately is not here, and the New American Foundation, and also some of my sponsors. Much of that research was funded by the Air Force Research Labs and RTI International. Let me get to the subject. Okay, well, my big point, if you want to study terrorism, is that you have to study it scientifically. And what I try to do is basically apply the scientific method to the study of terrorism. So you have to build a database, and then you use that database to test various claims about terrorism. And I was interested basically at the specific threat to the United States. So the way I started was taking the 19 guys who did 9/11 as my index sample and just grew it according to whoever had any operational relationship with them. I accumulate about 400 or 500 biographies now on them. And because a lot of information is erroneous on terrorism, I try to base it on trial transcripts. And from the trial transcripts, I then went to the field to investigate myself. So now that I have the data, I can test the conventional wisdom about terrorism. One of the conventional wisdom is that poverty breeds terrorism. And so I kind of looked at the family of origin of the terrorists. And as you can see, they're mostly middle class. So they're not poor themselves. Another version is, and here you have various versions of the brainwashing theory. One of them is that the culture or the family brainwashed them. And so here I kind of looked at the background of the terrorists, and you can see very much that they come from a fairly secular background, secular families. Another version is the madrasa theory of terrorism, namely that if the culture didn't brainwash them, the schooling did. And the madrasa is basically an Islamic boarding school. And here again, you can see that 87% did not go to madrasas. And those who did were basically confined to Southeast Asia, mostly. So it's not madrasas. Another version is that it was easy to brainwash them because it didn't have much to start out with because they were too young. And here I graphed the age at which they join a terrorist organization. And you can see that the average age is about 26 years. So they're not teenagers, they're very much young adult responsible. Another version is one of ignorance. And that's why it was so easy to brainwash them. So here I kind of looked at the educational level. The first column here, as you can see, is high school education. They graduated high school. Here some college, graduate college, master's, doctorate. 62% went to university, and this is much higher than even the American average, which is about 52%. So people say, so what? They go to university, but they study religion. Well, no, not really. If you ignore this, because those are the people who went to high school or vocational school, these are the guys who went to university, and you realize they're mostly in the technical field. It's mostly engineers. Terrorism has always been a problem of engineers. going back to the anarchists in 1872, where it was very much the Faculty of Engineering and Medicine that generated the first Russian anarchist who then went to Moscow to kill the Tsar a few years later. Another theory is that they don't have any jobs. And that's actually more complicated. Here I kind of graphed profession and semi-profession. As you can see, those two columns are higher than the unskilled labor column. But even though they were fairly well skilled, they were underemployed, relatively underemployed. And I'll come back to that. Now, a typical explanation for terrorism in the United States is that of sexual frustration. Yeah, I mean, that's what you get in the newspaper, and Muhammad was close to the 72 virgins, because this is also, of course, 72 virgin, or the testosterone theory of terrorism. And the argument is very simple. You know, those are Muslim, there's no premarital sex, and therefore they become so sexually frustrated that they literally go crazy and blow themselves up and people around them. So, you know, I'm an empiricist, so I kind of looked at, well, how many were married? You know, how many had access to sex, basically. And you can see that 73% were married. And usually in my audience, I have one or two doubters who tell me, yeah, well, you know, you can be married and still not have sex. So continuing my empirical research, I looked at how many had kids. And you can see 2/3 had kids, and they had plenty of kids. So the data actually refute the sexual frustration theory. And you can see that terrorists do not people do not become terrorists out of sexual frustration, but out of sexual exhaustion. You finally got it. Very good. Now, this is a Peter laugh. You know, if you have never heard Peter laugh, this is a typical Peter laugh. Sex has nothing to do with terrorism, it turns out. But if you label somebody a terrorist, you're willing to believe anything about that person. And my point here is that I would urge you to be a little bit skeptical and to use real data to test it. Okay. Another theory is that they're just criminals. They're just psychopaths, sociopaths. And here I show that about 90% did not have any arrest record, no criminal record before joining terrorist organization. So in terms of criminal background, the vast majority, no crime. But there is some crime there, and that sample is becoming more prominent with time. And I'll talk more about that. But usually the crime, a petty crime, credit card fraud, drug trafficking. But what people usually mean by criminal, they mean psychopath, sociopath, what in clinical term we call antisocial personality disorder. For that to occur, for that label to stick, you really need to have a long pattern of criminal activities going back to childhood. You have to have a conduct disorder. And here only basically 2 people that I know in my sample had that, namely Zarqawi and Jamal Amidon, who was probably the chief of the Madrid bombers. Okay, so if they're not bad, are they simply mad? And as a psychiatrist, I looked at that, and I found very little evidence of mental disorder. I think 4 of 400 believe in jinns, which are Islamic ghosts, and that's basically cultural consistent. But even if you look at it as a sign of psychosis, that still is 1%, and the worldwide average baseline on this, base rate on this is 3%. So you realize that they are healthier than the normal sample. No real personality disorder, no narcissism, and no real trauma. You know, usually they come from pretty good families. And if you remember the picture of Muhammad Atta at the age of 12 sitting on his mother's knee, they looking at each other lovingly, that's basically the picture of a terrorist at the age of 12. Typical picture of terrorist. Okay, so if people are not born terrorists and they become terrorists, what is the process? And this is what I want to address right now, and that's what I address in my book. And I want to talk about three topics, namely the radicalization, the mobilization into terrorist network, and the evolution of the threat over time. By radicalization, I just mean the path to political violence. I don't mean extremist views, because it is about violence that we're talking about, and not really so much extremist view. Without violence, I wouldn't be here. Nobody would be interested in what I have to say. And the dynamics are very similar to the dynamics that we see all the time with young people, namely young people chasing fantasies of glory, wanting thrills, but also a sense of significance and belonging to a group. And this is very much a bottom-up process. And what I'm going to show you is that you have basically four major factors in this process of radicalization. And I'll elaborate on each. One is a sense of moral outrage. That sense of moral outrage is interpreted in a specific way. And the reason that interpretation sticks to people is that it resonates with their personal experience of everyday life. But so far, you have a lot of people upset, but not doing much. Those who actually are active and become violent are those who are mobilized by networks. The sense of moral outrage is about a major moral violation. This is about anger. It's about outrage, not about humiliation. And the sense could be local and global. Globally, it's all about Iraq right now. If you go to a Muslim country, if you go to Europe and talk to a Muslim, and they know you're American, they want to talk to you about Iraq. Iraq now has become a black hole that sucks up every argument. Now, Iraq did not start this, because Iraq is 2003, 9/11 was 18 months prior to Iraq. At that time, it was mostly Chechnya, it was Palestine, it was Kashmir, it was Bosnia, it was Kosovo, and before that it was Afghanistan. So you can see it changes, but right now it's about Iraq. But also locally, communities are very leery and very vigilant about the representative of the state locally, namely police forces, and they're very vigilant how the police treats them. This is extremely important because if they show discrimination against them, they feel that they're in the same boat as what they see on TV in Iraq. It's the same. The local and the global reinforce each other and trigger this sense of Muslim identity. But this outrage has to be interpreted in a certain way. And the way it's interpreted is very simple. It's a war against Islam. And it's really paper thin. It's just a soundbite. Over the last 2 years, I went around the world looking at trials of terrorists who were captured and tried, and I realized that they were not Muslim scholars, they were not even intellectuals, they were punks, basically. And so that made me downgrade the importance of ideology moving, for those people moving. They're not the people who actually want to have theological debate. The people going to Iraq right now do not go there to have theological debate. They go there to blow themselves up. They go there to be heroes. This paper-thin idea, and by the way, and what they're attracted to right now, the third wave, what I will call the third wave, they're attracted to a rejectionist interpretation of Islam, where other Muslims are not really true Muslims to them. They're mostly takfiris right now. That's what the third wave is attracted to, and people really have not appreciated this, that they really look at other Muslims as infidels, the kufirs, as far as they're concerned, and that's why a lot of the victims are other Muslims as well. But this belief that it's a war against Islam is embedded into cultural beliefs. This is where the United States differs radically from Europe. Europe is built on a notion of an essence, a national essence, Frenchness, Englishness, Germanness, Italianness, and even the Germans and Italian coalesced into one country at the end of the 19th century on the basis of this essence. Whereas Our myth is that of a melting pot. Now, the importance of the difference here is that, the melting pot, the idea of a melting pot undermines the idea that you're targeted as, it's a war against Islam. Whereas if you are from South Asia or North Africa and you obviously do not belong to this essence of Frenchness, Germanness, and so on, it's very easy to believe that, yes, it is a war against you, especially if you face discrimination. And the second cultural belief that undermines this notion that it's a war against Islam is the notion of the American dream. Whether you believe it's true or not, and by the way, the American dream is the land of opportunity. That's the way it's seen from abroad. It's equal opportunity. And whether it's true or not, people believe it. And Muslims believe it. The Pew Research Center poll of a few months ago showed clearly that 75% of the Muslim expatriates here are true, strong believers of the American dream. And if you can see the reaction worldwide to our elections here, having a guy like Barack Obama, who is a personification of the American dream from abroad, really can change the view of the United States overnight if he's elected. And that's very much a perception of abroad. They just can't believe this. This is not feasible in Europe, I can tell you that. But the real reason why this notion of war against Islam really sticks to European as opposed to American is this resonance with the personal experience of everyday life. And in a sense, it's almost unfair to compare European Muslims with American Muslims. Traditionally, European Muslims went to Europe to reconstruct Europe. It's unskilled labor. Some countries started earlier than others. France and Germany started right after World War II, and now they have the third generation. But it's a third generation, though, that the grandson of unskilled labor, and they're facing a pretty tough labor market, and their unemployment rate is about 3 times the rate of the regular population, similar population. We, on the other hand, cherry-picked. And the Muslims who came to America were usually university professors, engineers, physicians, businessmen. So the average Muslim family last year made about $70,000, and the average American family made about $48,000. So this is 40% higher. So you can see it's really the exact opposite of the situation in Europe. And the children of the upper middle class, of course, face very different labor markets. They have many more jobs, and in a sense, they blend in much more easily. On the political front, you have a big difference in welfare policy. The reason Europe can tolerate such high rates of unemployment is that they have a pretty generous welfare state. We are pretty cold-hearted now here, and you work, you eat; you don't work, you starve. But this has an implication, and the implication is that by the time American Muslims, or American jihadis, I should say, not really Muslims, but terrorist wannabes, come back from work at 5 or 6, they're usually too exhausted to be full-time jihadis on the internet. This is not the case in Europe. But on the other hand, if you follow the money, as a lot of people suggest here, you realize that the state sponsors of terrorism are Germany, France, England, Canada, Australia, because most of the terrorist plots now are funded by welfare checks. It's usually people who use a check. About 60%, I think, the Australian told me, the Pendennis case, 60% financed through welfare. But it's not so much that you fund people in Europe and Australia to be full-time terrorists, it's really they're bored out of their minds. And you can't underestimate the importance of boredom in this. Because when you're bored, you don't have much to do, you don't have a level of significance. The thrill and the excitement and the attraction of belonging to the vanguard of, even a violent social movement is just irresistible. And that's probably what you have. And indeed, if you look at the rates of arrest between Europe, the difference between Europe and the United States, it's very telling. Post 9/11 up to about September of last year, when I accumulated that data, the rate of arrest for terrorism, and I don't mean financial support of terrorism, anything like that. I mean people build bombs and want to blow things up, violent terrorists. It's about to be really, really generous for the United States, because most of the cases here, entrapment, is about 60. Really generous. And I count the Miami 7, the Fort Diggs guys. I mean, all the classical case of entrapment that you have from the Bureau. In Europe, it's 2,400. And those are real terrorist plots where you don't really have entrapment. And some of them were successful, as in Madrid, the London bombing, the Hofstad group. So, you have very similar population. You have 300 million in the United States. You have 340 million in Europe. You have about 6 times the size of the Muslim population in Europe as you do in the United States, about 15 to 20 million. We have 2.5 to maybe 4 million Muslims here. You'd expect then to have 6 times the rate of arrest in Europe. Well, the real difference is 40 times. As I said, 2,400 to 60, just do the math. So you realize that Europe is facing 6 times the problem in terms of probability as we do, for the reason I just outlined. But so far you have a lot of people who are angry and they're still not terrorists. What really pushes them? Well, part of the answer is I looked at the circumstances under which people join a terrorist organization. And it turns out that about 2/3 were expatriates. And that was a surprise. And if you add the second and third generation, plus the expatriate worldwide, you have basically over 80%. It's about 84, 85% in my sample, but if you just look at Europe itself, it's over 90%, where you have a diaspora phenomenon. But still, that doesn't really explain why people become terrorists. And, as I just argued, no personal characteristic explains why people become terrorists. It's all over the map. But if you recall the way I defined a terrorist, I defined terrorists to whoever had an operational relationship with my index sample, namely the 19 guys who did 9/11. So I realized that the explanation may be in studying their relationship to each other. And here the first question one must ask is, what kind of relationship did they have to each other prior to joining terrorist organization? What was the base rate of this phenomenon, in other words, in scientific terms? And it turns out over 2/3 were friends who joined terrorist organization collectively, and another 1/5 were relatives, and they basically joined the family business. So what you had is very much spontaneously self-organized bunches of guys, networks of trust from the bottom up, and that accounted for about 90% of my sample. So you have a lot of self-selection and mutual self-recruitment. And here I found 2 major patterns. The first pattern, trajectory, was the expatriate pattern, which was far more common during what I call the second wave, the people who joined the 90s, than presently. And here you have the elite of the Muslim world from the Middle East who were sent to the West to study because the best universities are in the West. And it was in the West that they got radicalized. And how did that happen? Well, it was very simple. They became homesick, and then they adopted a Western lifestyle. That didn't really work, and so they started looking for other people like them. And where did Muslims hang out? They used to hang out at the mosque. So they went to the mosque not out of religiosity, but really for companionship. And there they met. They met over food in fast food halal places near the mosque. And if they liked each other, they moved in together to save money. And that's where the process of radicalization took place, in the intense interactivity and talks in their apartments. Another trajectory is now far more common, what's called the homegrown trajectory. And those are second, third generation of people who came as children to the West. Now I must say that even though they are raised and radicalized and joined terrorist organizations in the West, the idea does not come from the West. The idea is still very much Middle Eastern idea. So what we mean by homegrown, we really mean born, raised, and radicalized in the West. And again, you have young people are discriminated on the labor market, as I mentioned, so they don't really believe they're going to get a good job even if they stay in school, so they drop out of school as teenagers, they join gangs, and for 10 years they basically are gang members. And after 10 years they realize that there's no future, so they turn to religion to escape the predicament, very much like people with a drinking problem join AA. And it's a collective decision. So here you basically have the mobilization through networks. It's those people collectively who little by little slide into violence. And it used to be face-to-face, namely neighborhood gangs, student association, radical study groups. But now, over the last 2 or 3 years, what you have is a gradual shift to the internet, where it's about the interactivity of the internet. It's about chat rooms. It's about forums. And that's really transforming this threat, namely women and younger people come in, because younger people troll the internet, and women now can participate in discussion, whereas before they were excluded because these guys believe in the segregation of women from men. And the process of intensification of the commitment is a natural process of group dynamics, of increased commitment through interactivity. The group acts as an echo chamber, and you have mutual escalation of complaints, and people can withdraw more or less from society, where all their friends, all the interaction is with these common friends, and they distance themselves from former friends and family. And you have this process of in-group love and out-group hate. And after a while, they're ready to sacrifice themselves for comrades and also the cause that they have. A typical example is really the Madrid bombings. 5 of the 7 bombers who blew themselves up. Andrea Elliott had a wonderful article the Sunday after Thanksgiving, the New York Times. That was the lead of that New York Times magazine, showing what happened in the Jama Mezouag barrier of Tetuan. I had gone there before her to, and basically this is a depiction. The guys, this is Abdul Karim al-Khatami Street in that little barrio. It generated the 5 friends who went to Madrid to be drug dealers. And it was in Madrid that they radicalized and they blew themselves up. Now, interestingly enough, the guys that they played soccer with across the street in the southern half knew those guys, and they did not really believe the newspaper accounts that those guys were evil and so on. And, you know, these guys were not, they were very secular at the time of the Madrid bombing. One guy, his hero is John Travolta, and he had this Travolta haircut and so on. But in trying to investigate why their friends blew themselves up, they kind of started sharing similar belief in terms of significance and so on. And 2 years later, they go on to Iraq to blow themselves up. And we know that both from Morocco, where they left, and from the Sinjar database that we captured in Iraq, where they also figured over there. So basically, this is a network, as I have it and I closed my data, the generation of my database in December of 2003. So you see those dots are people, they connected, those are relationship, and you can see very dense clusters, densely associate with each other, clumped together, but loosely affiliated. And I think I take this slide to be the one that stopped the US government from claiming that they kept killing or capturing the number 3 guy of Al-Qaeda, because I asked our policymaker, could you show me the number 3 guy in Al-Qaeda here? And they started laughing, and because they're organized in a network, some people are very important, but it's not hierarchically organized. And so they stopped doing that, but the newspapers have not stopped. And so when Abu Layth al-Libi was killed a few weeks ago, he was named number 3 guy in Al-Qaeda, but that's not the case. My point to you here is that pre-existing social bonds that you can see here form the infrastructure of operational relationships, which I depict here. And you can see one cluster, one operation, with the exception of the Jamaah Islamiyah of Indonesia, Malaysia, because they were more hierarchically organized. It was 2 school teachers who recruited their best student to be the infrastructure of the JI. And I juxtapose them to show you that this indeed is very much infrastructure of operational links. But unfortunately, my first book was written in 2003, which I think did not appreciate how the threat has evolved since 2003. And looking back on it, we really face 3 waves of this threat. The first wave were basically the companions at arms of bin Laden. They went to Pakistan to fight the Soviets in the 1980s. They are called the Afghan Arabs, fairly well educated. The Egyptian predominated in that group, and the average age at joining Al-Qaeda around August of 1988. I think Peter in his book published founding documents of those meetings at the end of August 1988, showing that they coalesced into this organization, to this base. And those guys still form very much the leadership of Al-Qaeda Central. There is no evidence that bin Laden trusts anybody else. The leaders are still very much the old guard from the Afghan Soviet days. And there are about 2 dozens left, and they are vanishing and they're not being replaced. The second wave are the people who joined in the 1990s prior to 9/11. They were mostly the expatriates, and they were fairly well educated because they were mostly graduates, and they went to Europe and the United States for their education, and they got radicalized in the West, and they went to Afghanistan in the hope of being selected into Al-Qaeda. In a sense, Al-Qaeda is very much like Harvard. Harvard does not need to recruit. People want to go to Harvard. Al-Qaeda does not need to recruit. People want to become Al-Qaeda. And indeed, the acceptance rate at Harvard is 13%, and the acceptance rate for Al-Qaeda is about 15%. So you see, it's very much the elite of terrorism, of Islamic terrorism here. And so remember, Mohammed Atta looked for Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda never looked for Mohammed Atta. It's again a bottom-up type of pressure. And so a lot of people, hundreds, went to Afghanistan in the hope of being selected, and they became incorporated into Al-Qaeda, and there's still about 100 left of those. So you have about 150 people hiding in the border area between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and they're still there. The third wave is very much a post-Iraq generation, and those are terrorist wannabes. Unfortunately for those young terrorist wannabes, and here you have a degradation of the jihad. I mean, here you have fairly well-trained jihadis. These guys are basically 20-year-olds. They want to be heroes. They're poorly educated. Here you have the homegrown dominance, not the expatriate dominance. And they don't know how to link up with Al-Qaeda. The vast majority do not. Now there's some major exception to this. And the exceptions are the British. The Pakistanis British. And that's because 75% of that population come from the Mirpur district of Azad Kashmir. So they can link up to Kashmiris, terrorist organization that are fellow travelers of Al-Qaeda, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Toiba, and they get trained by those guys. And when they come back, they're trained, and they could be very dangerous. But the reason they link up is because they have usually a relative or friend in Pakistan who can make the bridge. This is not the case with other people who are turned away. Other people do make that linkage, but they're very rare, and it's really just chance encounter, whether it's in Damascus or whether it's in Mir Ali, which is really what happened with the Germans and the Danes. It was really just luck. So what you have here is it's a complete change of the threat. Here you have potentially 1,000, but they're poorly trained. So you have far more plots, but not really as well thought out. So you have far more arrests as well. And the lethality of the plot, like the Hofstad group, is very low. You have one guy who died, basically. And the third wave, the way to think of it is really an evolution in a Darwinian sense. You have this network that evolves. The habitat, the environment is very, very hostile, especially after 9/11, especially all those plots in Europe, after Madrid, after London, and also now in the Middle East, after the bombings in Saudi Arabia, in Morocco, in Algeria. Well, Algeria is it's a different situation, but in Egypt, and so you have a very hostile environment, but it's enabled by the internet, and so the social structure of this network is very much completely scattered, disconnected, but still very much connected virtually via the internet, which is what I call a leaderless jihad. And my point here, it did not evolve from the top down, from the theories of Abu Musab al-Suri, even though it's very similar. Everybody hates Abu Musab al-Suri because he insults everybody. I don't know if you read his book, which is actually very good, his 1,600-page book, The Call to Global Resistance. But that's basically his argument. We need to have, this type of leaderless jihad. My point is that this evolved organically from the bottom up. This is very much like a market. This is young people who are playing around and finding the way to become successful and linking with others. But my last point here is that this threat, I think, is a self-limiting threat. Now, why is that? Because you're looking at young people having fantasies of glory, thrills, and so on. And fantasies are subject to fashion. And usually young people define themselves in contrast to the older generation, even to the older brother. So if this attracts the older brother, it probably won't attract the young ones, like 16-year-olds. And we already see that happening in France, for instance, where it may have crested. France was one of the first countries to be subject to this problem. They had a wave of bombing in 1995. The riots in 2005, and 2 months ago, even though the Islamists tried to move in, they were completely unsuccessful. What 16-year-old French people want to do is to compete with a gang next the street over to see how many would burn cars, and basically it ended when they ran out of cars. But also, because it's on the internet, the leadership cannot impose discipline. So you basically have the followers who are the leaders. They decide what, from a variety of potential guidance, what they want to do, what they want to follow. And in a sense, it's the followers who are the leaders now. It's a complete reversal of the pyramid. And you can see that a little bit. There was something really fascinating that happened last month. Nobody really commented on it. I'm surprised. There was an invitation of the Al-Fajr, network, the 6 forums, password-protected forums that are linked to Al-Qaeda Central. And they invited young people to submit questions to Zawahiri, Ayman al-Zawahiri. And what's more fascinating is that they stopped, the questioning on January 16th. They gave a deadline. I mean, it's really wonderful how it's becoming bureaucratic now. And the sheikh was going to answer. Well, he still hasn't. It's 5 weeks later. But, what's fascinating is the questions themselves. The question is the young people say, what should we do? Tell us, give us guidance. I mean, that was really most of the question. Is it okay to kill people? Is it okay? I mean, they were completely clueless, and that's really what I mean here by the followers are in the lead. But basically, in this environment, you really have the inability of those groups to really coalesce into some physical political party, because that would be a target for both Western law enforcement and local law enforcement to eliminate them. But mostly, I think that the appeal itself is very limiting. If you really think about what the end product of Al-Qaeda is, it's really a Taliban. And, the 3 instances that I know that people captured territory and instituted something like the Salafi state, the Salafi utopia. It was in Afghanistan in the 90s. It was in some part of Algeria during the Civil War. And it was in Al-Anbar province. And in each instances, the local population turned against them because it's really unattractive. Although Peter warned me that we're supposed to be in Riyadh next week together, that it was Houston run by the Taliban, right? Is there anybody here from now? But the Taliban is unattractive. And so I don't think, it's not because of the end state that people do this, it's because of the process. They want to be recognized as heroes. It's about the process, it's not about the end stage. That's all I have to say now, and I'll field all your questions now. Thank you.
Marc, thank you very much for that. Marc, just two questions about the difference between when you did Understanding Terrorist Networks. I think your sample was something like 140, 170, and now it's up to 400 to 500 in Leaderless Jihad. What's changed over time about those samples is question one. And then question two, sort of a related question, is how did you decide which samples to collect? I mean, for instance, did you exclude people conducting terrorist operations in Afghanistan or Pakistan or Iraq? Was it largely Europe-centric? Did the targets have to be anti-Europe, anti-Western targets? What was the kind of methodology there?
Yeah, I basically include in my sample whoever went after the far enemy, because this is strictly Al-Qaeda. There was a debate in Khartoum in the first half of the 1990s about the near enemy and the far enemy. Khartoum basically was the place Hassan al-Turabi invited every terrorist, including Shia. And at that time, Hezbollah was, the terrorist organization. Those are good old days. In the 1992-93, they inaugurated car bombings. Well, actually, they popularized car bombing. First car bombing was right here on Wall Street, 1920. So that's a different anarchists. They were trying to understand why they had failed after 20 years of trying to overthrow their own government, the near enemy. And a small faction had argued that the reason that they had failed was that the far enemy was propping up the near enemy, and the far enemy being the West, namely the United States, France, former colonial power. and that they would never be able to overthrow the near enemy, their own government, until they expelled the far enemy from the Middle East. So my sample is very much people who go after the far enemy, non-Muslim governments or population.
But let me just drill in on that. So with the attack on the Serena Hotel in Kabul, which was directed at Westerners, would that be included in your sample? If you could find out who was involved, what would you exclude?
That's an excellent question. No, I did not include. I tried to make it as analytically pure as possible. So what I do include the foreigners going to Iraq, but I don't include Iraqis going after the U.S. government or the coalition forces, for instance, because I think that's defending your territory. So I have included. I included the Moroccans, for instance, because here the targets were not so much Moroccans, but they were Jews and Spaniards and foreigners. But in Kabul, those guys. As you know, Afghan fighting for the last 3,000 years is very similar, and there's a very strong xenophobic tinge to it. And I'm not really sure that those guys really believe in the far enemy. They just hate foreigners. And so because of this ambiguity, I did not include them. But I do include those guys who kidnapped Daniel Pearl, for instance. And I did include other people who had operational links with Al-Qaeda Central, namely the Saudis, in 2004. And, I agree it's messy, but at some point you have to decide, are those, similar or not. So I don't have any Palestinians here who go after the Israelis. I don't have Chechens who go after the Russians. And I don't have Iraqis who go in Iraq. But if the Iraqis travel elsewhere, then to me, it's an indication they go after the far enemy. So what really happened is that I collected the sample worldwide. It's not European-centric, but a lot of more information comes out of Europe because you have far better investigative journalism, and the trials are open, and they're not this sham that you have in many other countries.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Sageman. I'm Ahmed Yunus from the Gallup World Poll Center for Muslim Studies. When we poll Muslims globally that believe that 9/11 was justified, we find specific to the issue of religiosity no difference whatsoever between those that say yes, 9/11 was justified and those that say it doesn't. And clearly here we found the same thing with those that are actually engaging in terrorist activity. Which leaves the question, what is the role of religion and religiosity? What is the role of, what is the Islamic identity component of the paradigm of those that engage in this action? And if it's non-existent, then the use of, phraseology like jihad or Islamist comes into a new light. And maybe we are engaging in a discourse with words that are sourced in another time, but really have a completely new brand and a completely new meaning. And therefore jihad and Islamist are an appropriate description of the activities or the individuals that are engaged in the action.
It's a very important question.
Mark,
yes.
Could you just summarize it for the TV audience?
The question, what's the role of religion in this? Fair? Okay. My book is very thin. As you can see, I've been able to compress a lot of complex ideas into simple ones. And it's a very, very difficult question because, the role of religion has changed over time. The first two waves were pretty religious, it turns out. The first wave especially, those guys were very religious. The second wave, a little bit less, but the third wave, they know nothing about religion. And indeed, if you look at the Madrid case, you can see one or two of the guys who blew themselves up in that apartment in Leganes were not religious at all. One actually was gay. Another guy, Zuhair, was basically a stripper, who did not believe very much in the religion. So you see a watered-down version of religion over time. And in a sense, you have this degradation over time, like anything else. You remember the first guys had cell phones, they were the elite and so on. Everybody has cell phones 15 years later. And it's almost the same process as the phenomenon diffuses over time and gets wider. You really have a degradation of it. So I think it was really far more important in the first two waves than it is in the third wave. Fair?
And thus the use of the terminology then. Where
That's
then
right.
do you...
Well, I think that this is something that we all grasping because, and I'm guilty of it. I called my book Leaderless Jihad. I could have called it Leaderless Violent Social Movement of people who claim to be Muslims but probably are not and reject that. It's like I have to use a word. and in a sense, I'm very much guilty of that. But, I wanted people to understand what I was talking about. So Leaderless Jihad, perhaps have some kind of understanding of what I mean. But in a sense, it's a very fair criticism. This is not jihad. And, it's not really the jihad that most Muslims understand by jihad. But, I mean, a little bit stuck with vocabulary that you have. And, I hope that I can explain what I mean by jihad if asked. But I don't mean that all those guys are just Muslim and so on. And the interesting, the third wave, as I mentioned, are the rejectionists. So they very much takfiri. That's what they want to do. And it's not so much out of religion. They really want to be heroes. And to them, the hero, actually, it's very interesting. We asked young Muslims, who are the heroes? And universally, if you go around North Africa or the barriers of Spain, the first guy is usually a soccer star. And it's usually a soccer star from Barcelona, and I don't understand that. It's never, Real Madrid or something like that. It's very much Barcelona stars that has a lot of currency in North Africa, at least. The second I was surprised and say our because I conducted this research with Scott Atran, is the Terminator. And the fascinating thing that those kids had no idea that the Terminator was actually the governor of California. And the third was Bin Laden, of course. And so what you do is that you have this poverty of role models in the Cité, in North Africa, for various reasons, because I don't think the local governments allow local heroes to emerge because they would undermine the legitimacy of their rules. But this is what you have. And so the role model, those are young people following their role model is very much becoming a terrorist.
Alan Nichols, Washington Diplomat Magazine. Could you comment a little bit more about Europe? Certainly when you think of the cartoons in Denmark and Norway, that seems to be related to religion. The clerics in the UK are radicalizing thousands of young Brits and saying we want Sharia in the United Kingdom. So what's your prognosis for Europe?
My prognosis for Europe is actually pessimistic. But, I wouldn't put too much emphasis on the cartoons. The cartoons were orchestrated from the Hajj, The cartoons had been published in September, and you didn't see a reaction until basically December, when some people really kind of met at the Hajj in Mecca and decided to have a worldwide campaign against it. In terms of the preachers of hate, those kids don't really listen very much to them anymore. What they want to do is they really want to be, the heroes fighting the Americans or the Soviets. There's a lot of bragging and pretending, but it's really about hero worship more than religion that I see now, because many of them just discover religion 2 or 3 weeks or even a month before doing anything. It's very rapid. And again, the third wave is very different from the first two, where you had people who actually read the Quran. I don't think, and most of the kids now that you see in Europe or Indonesia don't really read Arabic, know nothing about Arabic. They speak in their own vernacular languages.
Why are you pessimistic about Europe?
Oh, because Europe is basically an aging population, and they can't sustain their economy unless they import labor. And in the last 2 or 3 years, they were lucky to import the labor from Eastern Europe, but that's basically drying up. And now they still have to go back to where they were after World War II, namely North Africa, South Asia. And Europe, I don't think, knows how to incorporate, assimilate non-Europeans within itself. You know, we're a country built on immigration, and we do immigration pretty well. Europe does not, so it will be a while before they will find out. And there is a lot of efforts and attempt to do it, but they're failing. They still are. And so I'm pessimistic for the next few decades, because what you really need to do is that you need to educate the local host population about the benefits of immigration. And for them, it's a necessity. They will not be able to survive without this influx of young people coming in to actually take most of those jobs.
Go ahead and select.
I'm sorry?
Go ahead and select.
Oh, okay. Well, this lady in the center there.
Yeah, I'm Mark.
Oh, hi, how are you?
That was great. Diane Perlman. First of all, some of the literature that I'm familiar with talks about, in the radicalization, about a breaking point that people go through, like if their sheikh is assassinated or their brother is killed, or I think for Bin Laden was Sabra and Shatila. So that's one question. The other one is, I appreciate your emphasis on moral outrage, and could you distinguish that from humiliation in terms of effectiveness? And also, I thought that if Obama became our president, that it would change our image in the world and probably reduce a lot of anti-Americanism.
If Obama was what?
Became president, that it might
Obama,
reduce,
yes.
like as you were saying, reduce maybe desire to take revenge on.
I heard
others.
Osama.
I'm
I'm not sure who would vote for him.
I might have said that, sorry. But
Maybe some of the far-right Democrat, far-left Democrat, but they didn't.
do you think that might reduce some of the desire to take revenge on others, or some potential for violence here?
All right. The first one was the notion of trauma trigger. I found there's no trauma trigger in this group. This is a very natural process. There is no, the way we tell stories, we usually privilege events, and that's not the case. It's really interaction. It's a process of interaction. It's an everyday process that you see, the change of opinion. Change of opinion is discussing things with your friends, with your family. It's this interchange, interaction that you see. So, no, I don't see any, I think in my slide, I didn't see any trauma. Trauma begets trauma and so on. Not in this group. You're talking about the Chechens, perhaps. You're talking about the Palestinians, but you're not talking about this group. This group is privileged in many ways, especially the first two waves. Very privileged kid, no trauma whatsoever, no big event that would trigger this. Your second point was humiliation and moral outrage. Moral outrage makes people angry. Those guys are not humiliated, and I think there's going to be quite a few studies showing that humiliation is inversely linked to violence. People are humiliated, do not become violent. It's the opposite, and that's a study done on Palestinian population, people who watch humiliation would become violent, but not the people who are humiliated themselves, which is kind of interesting. In terms of Obama, as I mentioned, yes, Obama, because of who he is, will not change the view of the people who are already terrorists. Those guys are gone. You just have to eliminate them. There is no way to kind of rehabilitate, although I think the Saudis are going to try to convince us otherwise. But so far, I have not seen, good evidence of, quote, rehabilitation. But because of Obama representing the American dream, that will undermine in the larger population in the world this notion that that they are facing a Zionist American conspiracy, which is how they view it. In a sense, the United States is controlled by, the 12 elders of Zion. This is one of the most commonly held view in the Muslim world. And the Obama presidency, because of who he is, not because of his policy, because if you look at the policy, they're very similar to Hillary Clinton's, but of who he is. And this is one of the fluke of history that you do have an example of a person that would undermine the other guy's argument by just who they are. This gentleman here, yes.
Thanks. Gary Mitchell from the Mitchell Report. I want to be sure that I understand and or am not misinterpreting the case that you've been making today. Other than what we've heard in the room today, virtually every other report that I'm aware of says that A, Al-Qaeda is rebuilding, and B, so are the Taliban. And what I want to know is it your position, and does your research suggest that that A and B are in error? And the follow-on question to that is, what is your prognosis for, or your projections about where what we call jihadism, or whatever term one wants to use it, the global Islamist terrorist threat, where is that headed?
The second one is easier. Well, I mean, they're both easy to answer. Second one really depends on the circumstances at the time. In a sense, I mentioned that the third wave was very much inspired by the Iraq invasion. And there may be, some hints that this was basically fading away until the Iraqi invasion. After 9/11, you had, when Al-Qaeda Central was scattered around the world, you had a lot of plots. I mean, and some of them were successful, such as the Lindbergh bombing, some were not. But then it faded, and then the new people coming in were very different from the old one. Those are the guys who could not make the link, but still were outraged by what happened in Iraq. So what's going to happen in the future, I think this will fade away again, if we have the good sense to allow it. This will fade away for internal reason, like every terrorist wave has faded so far. Whether it was the anarchists, whether it was the anti-colonialists, whether it was the leftists, it wasn't so much because of force of repression. The key question is, why are young people attracted to this specific ideology at this particular time? And right now it's because it's jihadi cool, into fashion, and you find that very much in Northern Europe and in Britain. So if we have the good sense to let it decay for internal reason, this will decay. But terrorism is not dead. Something else will replace it. Maybe not this, but some other idea. In terms of the so-called resurgent, I would agree that Al-Qaeda Central, which I defined as those 150 people, 140 people in Waziristan, was given a new lease of on life because the environment, the habitat, became less hostile, from the Pakistani tribal agreements, and there were three, Bojor province first, then South Waziristan, then North Waziristan. And so that allowed those guys who were hiding to come out more in the open, and being able to connect with young Europeans coming to Mir Ali to really meet with them. Before they were completely hiding, they were a little bit more in the open. There may be now a reversal of that. It depends on what's happening in Pakistan. It really does, and that changes from day to day. Whether the Massoud tribe or maybe the Jadran tribe is going to really give them sanctuary, that will depend day to day. So it's not so much that there was a resurgence, but there was more visibility because of the less hostile environment, and that was specific from about 2005 onwards. But as I said, the young Europeans making contact with Al-Qaeda are not incorporating to Al-Qaeda Central. They turned around and sent right back to Europe to conduct operation. And most of them have been arrested, but some of them were successful. I mean, 7/7 was exactly that. It was a successful connection to Al-Qaeda. They were trained by, if not Al-Qaeda, an Al-Qaeda fellow traveler. The Germans were trained by the Uzbekis, the IJU. The Danes were trained by Al-Qaeda, and the guys who were arrested on August 10th of 2006, the planes plot in London, those were trained by Al-Qaeda Central. So yes, you do have more connection visibility, but that really depends on how hostile the environment is. So I don't really see a resurgent. For me, a resurgent means that they have to be able to project elsewhere outside of Waziristan. And so far they haven't been able to because, I think law enforcement and agencies are not sleeping either, and they are able to detect and to disrupt those plots. Okay, let me kind of get something from the back there. Go. All right, yeah, you go ahead.
Okay. I'm Deborah Duong from the Office of the Secretary of Defense. You've used your research to refute the notion that poverty breeds terrorism, but I'd like to question your methodology of looking to see if terrorists are poor or not. You might want to say that moral outrage of poverty breeds terrorism in the same way you would like to say that injustice breeds a civil rights movement. And also, you don't want to say that poverty breeds the American military, even if the people who are in the military are generally, on the average, more poor than the other people. So.
Well, you have to look at the process of becoming a terrorist, and really, and poverty really does not figure anywhere along that process. It's only the rationalization afterwards that people rationalize their actions. Oh, yeah, we do it. But if you look at either the first wave, you look at the second wave, or even the third wave, poverty is not a factor. It just isn't.
Mark, just to clarify, I think the question is, it's not that poor people become terrorists. The question is poverty somehow implicated in this, in the sense that the people who, most of the revolutionaries in the French Revolution were not peasants, at least the people actually running it. But the people who were involved in running the French Revolution were not peasants. They were sort of in the main people from the middle or upper middle classes. So is that?
No, it's about injustice. It's really about injustice. And by injustice, I mean killing, rapes, and arrests, unfair arrests. Then poverty comes in later on as a justification, but it's really injustice. That's why you have the sense of moral outrage. It's about injustice. Those people want to build a better world, and so then they throw in poverty as an afterthought and say, oh, and we got. But it's really about justice. It's about justice. It's a fight for justice. Yeah, go ahead.
Like some of your further, Bob Shadler, like your further comments on how they focus on a target for their terrorism. We talk about they hate us and that 9/11 changed everything, and obviously we're more concerned about when we're the target. But terrorism seems to be broadly distributed from Saudi Arabia to Morocco to Turkey to Spain to Germany. And I'd be interested in also if the three waves that you've identified have a different process or a different focus. Is the United States simply because it's the sole superpower and has a high profile in the world as opposed to, say, Uruguay? Or is it tall buildings? Or is it, what are some of the processes by which they focus on where they're going to have a terrorist attack?
Well, usually, if they had their preference, they would like to go against a uniform American because it's the last superpower left. But that's a little difficult, and that probably would mean that they have to travel to Iraq, and some of them do, but not that many, it turns out. Very few actually do, especially from Europe or, or the Maghreb. Now, there are a lot of Libyans, which are still a question mark. We don't really understand the dynamics of 21% of the Sinjar database were Libyans, which came as a surprise to everybody. So we don't really understand where that's coming from. But that's number one. But it's a little bit difficult because it's difficult to get to Iraq. Then, if that doesn't work, they would love to go against official Americans. And so there it would be embassies or other symbols of America abroad, because they don't even try to come here. we don't arrest them at the airport trying to come into the United States. They completely discouraged by those long lines of that frustrate us. And we should become terrorists, because of frustration, aggression hypothesis here. But they're completely discouraged from even coming here, so don't even try. And that's great, So we basically build big walls against, outsiders coming in. And then what happens is that, they can't really get American, but then in the process really start focusing on acquiring the means of destruction. And that's really a full-time job. And they don't really give targets too much thought. Even the guys who are trained by Al-Qaeda Central, like for instance the Germans that were arrested in Neue Ulm, they didn't really have a target. I mean, they talked about many, but those guys get so involved in acquiring the weapons, in mixing the chemicals, that's a full-time job. And once they have the weapons, they will take the first target of opportunity. That's why you have public transportation, because it's by far the most vulnerable and gets the biggest bang for your buck, in a sense. So that's kind of the process, because they're very vulnerable when they have the weapons and they don't really sit on it. I think in Madrid, it was the longest period of them sitting on the weapon. That was it was 11 days, 10 days. I want to kind of get in the back because I'll get back. Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
My name is Carrie Lamack from Families of September 11, and I'm curious, you've done a great job of outlining who these people are, where they come from. What do you think we can do to stop them from turning into terrorists? Talk about how we can counter this transition.
Well, the one thing we can do is not to encourage them to become terrorists. I mean, it's a negative thing in a sense. The invasion of Iraq really did stimulate the third wave, but as I said, Iraq did not cause 9/11. It happened 18 months afterwards, and 9/11 was even plotted during before the Intifada, when the Israeli and Palestinians were getting along. So, people who kind of tend to blame everything, it was for internal reason that they plotted that plot. But what we can do is not to encourage young people to joining this movement. And that really means not really making a mistake that could encourage them. But in terms of the positive thing to do, as I mentioned, the reason that they believe it's a war on Islam is because it resonates with the everyday experience. And here we're doing much better with our American Muslim communities, because there's no such thing as a Muslim community. There are many Muslim communities, both here and abroad. And it turns out that all foreign countries are sovereign, and they don't really like to have American advice on how to deal with their own population. So, in a sense, we're a little bit stuck. 9/11 was very much imported from the outside here, and we have very limited power of telling foreign governments what to do about their own population. So we're a little bit stuck. We were really kind of, in a sense, caught in the crossfire before. Yes, go ahead.
Judd Harriet, documentary filmmaker. I was intrigued by your comment when you were talking about the deterioration of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. You said, if we have the good sense to let this thing, I forget exactly the word you used. I'm interested in how does that, having the good sense not to interfere with the process, how does that translate to specific policy actions? It may be related to the answer you just gave.
Well, you have to have a much smaller footprint in Iraq, for instance. Whether it's withdrawal and so on, you can't have Americans killing Muslims, no matter what. I mean, that's almost strategic on any kind of foreign TV. So that's part of it. Afghanistan is much more complicated than people realize, and in a sense, as I mentioned, Al-Qaeda Central has not grown, but there is very strong evidence that Al-Qaeda did make strategic alliance with some, for better words, Taliban leaders. I hate the word because, again, we have a disease of lumping everybody together into one thing. And our strategy should always be you look at the specific vulnerabilities of each little group and you play them against each other. That's been what the British political agents have done for a century, and were able to control the area without an army because they were able to kind of play this role. Divide and rule is one of the oldest strategy and works pretty well. But by lumping everybody into one category, we actually unify them against us in a sense. And it's a little bit what we did. So when we call everybody Taliban, they're not really Taliban. They're various tribes, and they all, kind of resist the central government. Sometimes they resist us. Sometimes they flip-flop, and they have alliances. They have enmities, and they go back and forth. It's very, very fluid, and it always was. This is the great game that people used to be able to know how to play in Afghanistan. But what has happened lately is that there has been an alliance among, part of some tribes, and it's not the whole tribe. Even the Massoud tribe is very divided. But some people did make alliance, and so some of the Al-Qaeda trainers did train some Afghans, young Afghans, to do things. And so you have the tactic of suicide bombing that did not exist before, really 2 years ago. I mean, this is, the increase was really tremendous. And so what you have, what people call Al-Qaeda, Taliban, by lumping them together, there is now an alliance. But it's a very fragile alliance because Afghans are always going to stay Afghans and may turn on the foreigners as they did after 9/11. And that explains part of our success. They flip-flop, but then, we stay too long, and then they kind of turn against us because they really feel it's xenophobic, and then we threaten the local way of life, and change will come in Afghanistan, but very slowly and not from the top down. And I think that's what the Soviets learned in 10 years, and that's what we're starting to learn right now. So when we look at this alliance, it's fairly complicated, and I think what we should do of Afghanistan is exactly what we did for Al-Anbar province, namely realizing that the tribes and the foreigners are not the same. We drove a wedge between them, and then the tribes now are doing the fighting against the foreigners, and that's really what we need to do for Afghanistan. Yes?
Colonel Datta, Foreign Policy Association. Al-Qaeda has no physical boundaries. It lives in the minds and hearts of people of about 67 countries touched by Islam. But the teaching of Islam erroneously given by these mullahs, which has not been properly explained and interpreted. And Islam teaches peace, but how is it that nearly all terrorists are Muslims? Nearly all terrorists are Muslims. But what is it that has really driven them to it is, I think, the basic wrong interpretation of Islam by the mullahs, half-baked, half-illiterate mullahs. They have really interpreted that God Almighty has created all newly born as Muslims. And this is the kafirism which has taken them to the other religion. Otherwise, they have to be ordained and act as Muslims. So
Do you have a question?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
That you have not touched upon the education of, as a matter of fact, of correct interpretation of Islam, because so much money has been wasted in Saudi Arabia and other Muslim countries, and this point has not been touched to correct the interpretation of Islam. This is breeding the terrorism.
Well, my data is very clear that it does not, and it's crystal clear about it. Only 87% did not go to, had nothing to do with Islam, did not go to Muslim school were not even religious until much later in life. And it turns out that the first two waves, as I said, were a little bit more religious, used to actually read Sayyid Qutb or other people, but not the third wave. The third wave does not read, they don't know much, and they don't even know Arabic, so they don't really come so much under the influence. It's really very much about following your hero. And it's about being cool. It's about jihadi cool. That's really, you're talking about a youth culture. So maybe you're right, and it's an internal Muslim problem about what's the correct interpretation, but this is not about this, about what you're talking about.
Okay, we have, I think, time for 3 more questions, and they should be questions, not statements.
Right.
So, Anish Bhatt, Africa Center for Strategic Studies. So, with regard to the third wave, the thing that set off the third wave was invading Iraq. So, if, say, Obama wins in the fall and planned withdrawal from U.S. personnel, what is that thing in general that's going to keep the third wave together? Is it going to continue being a cool jihadi, or is it going to be something else? Because right now the thing that holds them together is anger over the invasion of Iraq.
It's being jihadi cool. I think that I don't think McCain is going to get a honeymoon period around the world. Obama is going to get a larger honeymoon period, but it's not going to last more than 4 months. It's very much what he's going to do. I mean, people do get a window for a while, and especially because people don't know anything about him. He represents their fantasy. They project stuff on him. Hillary Clinton will be in between the two, but because McCain was so much of an advocate of Iraq, he's not going to get that honeymoon period. So I don't know what's going to happen afterwards, but in a sense, what's going to defeat this? Probably drug, sex, and rock and roll, because you're talking about youth culture, and that's what they're going to become attracted to at some point. And it's going to be much cooler to be a singer than a jihadi. But right now that's the model. That's the role model. Yes.
John Wallace, New American Foundation. In your process of radicalization that you described for sort of transnational terrorists, do you see that having any relation to those who fight a near enemy, say Iraqis or Palestinians? And how do you relate those terrorists to the third wave of terrorists since the Iraq invasion?
They don't have much to do, but sometimes there's cross-pollination. For instance, when the Israelis invaded Lebanon, not last summer, summer before, is it really? Gee, it's already that. Nasrallah was, a Shia, was very, very popular among Sunnis who consider Shia to be apostates. So, you have this type of, it's about heroes. And so it made them proud. It's about pride as well, of being, all right, we kick their butt. That was their mentality. But otherwise, there really is no real link. But people do take, the heroes wherever they are. And I think that's really what happened. This gentleman in the back there had the question.
Elvis Barksdale. Over the years, I have kind of witnessed Al-Qaeda and the Taliban becoming more of an idea rather than an organization. Are we, in fact, overstating the effectiveness of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban as an organization? Or are we watching loosely jointed individuals committing acts and then the organization taking credit for that?
I think you're right. I think we've overstated the importance of Al-Qaeda, with all due respect to, all those people who died on 9/11. We have used scare tactics, and we've exaggerated, and in a sense, we caught in that. But I want to make it clear that Al-Qaeda still exists. Those 140 people, if the world stops its vigilance and the containment of it, they want to kill us. They're still alive. And they can be very dangerous because they really know how to build bombs and so on. So I think it's fading, but it's not dead. And if we relax our vigilance, they may come back with a vengeance. But I also want to disaggregate the Taliban from Al-Qaeda. The Taliban is almost any resistance to central government. And there are a lot of them. There are far more of them than there are Al-Qaeda. There are thousands and thousands of them. And the networks are very much tribal networks, and it's really local reason that you have. And that's not really much of an idea. There is no idea of the Taliban. Those are people fighting, and they're fighting locally. Al-Qaeda became part of an idea worldwide as an inspiration more than an idea. But the idea is very much an anti-Americanism and anti-Zionism because the two are linked in their mind. So I don't think it's just an idea. There's some real people there and some very dangerous people. But I think that your main point is right. I think we've over-exaggerated the threat. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And Dr. Sageman will sign books outside.